We are still looking at African creation myths this month on the MA podcast, and it's been a great run so far. In the first episode, we established an explanatory framework for creation myths by sorting them out into 5 major categories: creation from nothing, creation by emergence from a cave or underground, creation by or through a male and female principle or world parent, creation from a cosmic egg, and creation by earth divers, when a cosmic entity descends from the realm of the gods to create earth. We've also seen examples of these myth types from across the continent, and if you listen to the first 2 episodes of this month, you can hear those stories again. We took a small detour last week to explore the reason behind different versions of the same myth, and I'm glad we did that because this week we're looking at the Mande creation myth, which is one version of a myth told by the Bambara, the Dogon, and other Sahelian people who claim a common ancestry. I'm very excited to spend time on this story because it's one of the best documented and analyzed myths from the African continent. It is also rich in symbolism and communicates so much about how the Mande-speaking peoples and all other people who claim it as theirs understand their arrival and situation on Earth. This is a long myth, so we'll examine just the segment that describes the creation of the Earth. That way we can take our time to make the necessary connections and enjoy the deliciousness of it all. So are you ready? Let's do it. Hello friends, and welcome to the Mythological Africans podcast, where we read and talk about stories from African mythology and folklore. I am your host, Helen Mbe. When Mangala decided to create all that exists, he created the Balaza seed first. But the Balaza seed was hard, and so it failed. Mangala created 2 new seeds, Fani Berere and Fani Ba. Then Mangala made 3 more pairs of seeds, Sanyo and Keninge, So and Kende, Kaba and Malo. Together with Fani Berere and Fani Ba, these seeds would procreate and cover the earth. He grouped the seeds into pairs and assigned each pair to an element and to a cardinal point. And so Fani Berere and Fani Ba belonged to Klebi, or the west. Sanyo and Keninge belonged to Koro, or the east. So and Kende belonged to Kanyaga, or the north. And Kaba and Malo belonged to Worodugu, or the south. Mangala wrapped up these pairs of seeds in a hibiscus seed, which the wise ones call the placenta of the world. Mangala did something else. He created an additional pair of twins, one male, which he called Pemba, and the other female, which he called Musokoroni Kundai. He placed these twins in the placenta of the world as well and set it aside to germinate. Oh, but Pemba, you see, Pemba wanted more than the others. Pemba wanted more before the others. And so before he was even ready, Pemba broke out of the placenta of the world, tearing away from his twin, Musokoroni Kundai. He fell down into the nothingness of space, falling and falling into the emptiness. The part of the placenta that tore off when he broke out became the earth, and eventually Pemba fell on it. He stood up and looked around, but all he could see was dry and barren land. He walked the length and breadth of earth and found nothing. I can't do anything here, Pemba thought to himself, so he returned to the placenta of the earth to find his twin and resume his place. But he could not. In his absence, Mangala had turned the remaining piece of his placenta into the sun. This angered Pemba, so he stole the male seeds of the 8 pairs Mangala had put in the placenta and took them to earth, carrying them in a calabash. He landed in a place near what we know today as Lake Debo and planted the seeds there. But they all died, all except for Fani Berere. They died because Pemba had stolen them and planted them in his own placenta, a piece of his mother's womb. This polluted the earth. Fanny germinated and thrived because it took to the blood of the placenta, and so it has its red color. Back in the seed, Mangala made a plan to atone for Pemba's disobedience. First, Mangala replaced Pemba with another being, Pharaoh. Mangala gave Pharaoh the form of the twin fishes, Manongo Ble, which represents life and strength, and Manongo Fi, which represents the body. Then, Mangala cut Pharaoh's body into 60 pieces and scattered them through space. The pieces fell to the earth and became trees. Mangala then resurrected Pharaoh as a human and sent Pharaoh down to earth on an ark made with a piece of the placenta of the earth. The ark, when it arrived Earth, landed in a place near what we know today as Mande in Kulikoro. The place is called Mande, which means son of the Manogo or son of a person. This is because Pharaoh, and by extension all humans' first form, was that of a Manogo fish. The place is also called the mountain that encircles the world, because the people believe Pharaoh came out of this mountain, taking his life from the cloudy sky of Mande. The place where the ark came to rest was also near a cave called Kabakoro. There is a pool near this cave called Kokoro, but then it was without water. It is here on this mountain, near this cave and pool, that the rest of the beings and the things created by Mangala arrived. First, Pharaoh, who was brought back to life. Then, the 8 original ancestors of all humans. 4 pairs of male and female twins formed from Pharaoh's placenta. Next came all the plants and animals that would multiply and populate the earth. Then came the first bard, Surukata. Surukata came holding in his hands the skull of Pharaoh who was sacrificed. This skull became the first drum. When the newly created earth needed rain, Surukata played on the drum to ask for the rains, but the rains did not come. And so Surukata left the drum in the cave. Not long after, the first blacksmith, Ndomadiri, came to earth, and then Musokoroni Kundaye, Pemba's female twin, arrived. But the earth still needed rain, and so Ndomadiri, the blacksmith, struck a rock with his hammer to ask for rain. The skies heard, and water poured down, soaking the earth and filling the pool at Kokoro with water. When the pool had formed, Manongo Ble and Manongo Fi, the first 2 manifestations of Pharaoh, came down from the placenta of the world to live in Kokoro. This is the first half of this creation myth, and we'll stop here for now so we can talk about it. Let's start with getting to know the Mande-speaking people. Emphasis on speaking because from what I understand, Mande is a linguistic group under which many different ethnic groups fall. And so Mande-speaking ethnic groups include the Bambara, the Malinke, the Soninke, the Vai, the Bisa, and many more. By some oral traditions, even the Dogon of Mali are a Mande people. Now, if you know anything about these peoples, then you know the countries from which they come, which means Mande-speaking people can be found in 9 West African countries: Mali, Guinea, Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Mauritania, and Gambia. Mande-speaking peoples trace their origins back to some of Africa's most eminent ancient cities and empires. This includes the city of Djenné and the Ghana, Mali, and Songhai empires. They are also very widely dispersed across West Africa, so you will find aspects of Mande culture and oral traditions in several West African countries and among several West African peoples. From what I understand also, this version of the creation myth, which I have retold slightly for modern audiences, was recorded in the 1950s by the research team associated with French anthropologist Marcel Griaule. The story is recited by griots, who are West African bards, as part of a ceremony held every 7 years to rebuild the sacred sanctuary in the town of Kangaba in Mali. Now, Kangaba is a town of great historical and cultural significance. It was once known as Kaba, and it is near here that Sundiata Keita, the great founder of the Mali Empire, declared the Kurukan Fuga, or the constitution of the Mali Empire. It was also an important location for the resistance against French rule in colonial times. I really need to emphasize that there is some controversy around the conditions under which Marcel Griaule and his team supposedly recorded these stories, and so this calls into doubt the accuracy of the translations from the account. There is a paper in the episode notes which goes into this. However, from every indication, the translations may have some issues, but the general story is reliable. And the controversy around it is that this ceremony, this rebuilding ceremony that happens in Kangaba is still very secret. There are no recordings allowed, and so Marcel Griaule had to manipulate things and kind of use colonial influence to get his way. And some of the translators he used were Mande-speaking people, but not from the part of Mali where this account is told. So there are questions about if the translations are accurate. But what is true and for certain is that every 7 years, the people who claim Mande heritage, especially those from prominent clans like the Keita, the Diabate, and the Kouyaté, gather together to rebuild the sanctuary. And so they renew the floors, they rebuild the walls, paint symbols on the walls. But before they put up the new roof, the bards and elders enter into the room, and over the course of a night, the griots recite this creation myth, they recite the people's genealogies and other important historical events. The Epic of Sundiata is one of such stories that are recited on the night of the ceremony. There are a couple of things that I find striking about this myth. The first is just the context in which it is traditionally recited. I think one of the worst things of the age we're in is that many of us hear these stories on podcasts such as these or read about them in books. As I mentioned before, there are few, if any, recordings of this ceremony, so you would really have to be present to experience it, to know it fully, and you'd have to speak the language too and have the context to understand what is being revealed. So very few of us will ever get the experience of actually being part of the Kangaba ceremony, right? To be at that geographical location that is so important historically and culturally, listening to griots who remind the people of who they are, starting with how they even arrived on earth, and then telling the story of their people, reminding them of the kinship they have with the land, with plants, with animals and other creatures, reminding them who their allies and enemies have been over the centuries, and the many ways in which they have struggled and triumphed across time. I can't imagine what that experience is like. The second most striking thing about the myth is that you can just hear woven into the narrative that is presented, the people's understanding of and appreciation for the plants and animals and landforms that are the building blocks of their very existence. The seeds that are mentioned in the beginning are all common and very important plants to the people, not just Mande-speaking peoples, to basically all West African people. The balaza seed is a seed of the acacia plant, famously hard and difficult to germinate unless scratched or nicked or soaked in hot water. So not exactly the easiest plant to use to populate a newly created earth and nourish its denizens with. Fanibere and Faniba, however, are species of goose grass, Eleusine indica and Eleusine corcora, and these grasses are common to the continent and would be among the first plants to take over freshly turned earth. Sanyo is the millet plant. Keninge and Kende are species of the sorghum plant. So is the bean plant. Kaba is the corn plant, and Malo is the rice plant. The hibiscus seed, in which all of these seeds were gathered, is a plant that is known across the continent, across the world, to be a beautiful decorative flower, but also the base of a most delicious tea that is so popular across West Africa. And shout out to Folere, as we call it in Cameroon. I believe it's also called Bisa. Even the fish, Manongo blé and Manongo fi, are species of catfish, specifically Claria senegalensis and Heterobranchus bidorsalis. And these fish are found in the Niger River and other freshwater bodies across the continent. My understanding is that eating the catfish is a taboo for some Mande clans, understandably, but catfish is probably the most common protein source across the continent for places that are near rivers. The location where these events unfold is also interesting. My understanding is that these events all unfold in locations at various points along the Niger River, including the Lake Debo area, which floods and then dries out with the rainy and the dry season. And so this makes me wonder if this particular myth is tied to memory of how the ancestors of the Mande-speaking people came to understand the seasons and the cycles of the land and use that knowledge to figure out planting seasons, as well as which plants will thrive and which plants would. You can imagine using symbolic language like that to say, well, when you come to a new piece of land, understand that sometimes it will be dry and barren in the dry season, but then the rains will come, and then these are the seeds you plant. Don't plant the acacia seed because it's going to take forever to germinate. But if you start with the grasses and you grow these other seeds, then you would have a bountiful harvest. These are the fish you can eat. This is how you should behave. These are the pools. These are the caves you can go to for shelter, etc. I say this because there is the part where Pemba finds the land dry and barren, but it's not until Pharaoh comes from the clouds in the mountains with trees and a blacksmith who knows how to call the rains that the land is flooded and the sacred pool at Kokoro is filled. And there are other parts of the myth which we will not look at this episode, but I'll include the paper, of course, in the episode notes if you want to read more. And you'll hear more about how these newly created beings explore the lands. They use stars like Sirius to make sense of things, planting season, navigation, and all of that. So there is so much that goes into this myth that speaks to how much the people truly understood their environment. The myth also layers different creation myth types on top of each other. If you're paying attention, it starts with creation out of nothing. So Mangala makes the seeds out of literally nothing, and then proceeds to the world parent theme. Mangala makes male and female counterparts of each seed, and each thing he creates, the twins. And then you have the cosmic egg theme. And I say this because in some translations, the bundle of seeds that Mangala created is called the egg of the world, not the placenta of the world. And so you will read versions of this story in which it is said that Mangala created an egg from which all things emerged. And then we see the earth diver theme when Pemba leaves the placenta and falls down to earth. And this is repeated when Pharaoh also leaves the placenta and goes down to earth on an ark. Now, speaking of Pharaoh, my understanding is that in some versions of this myth, Pharaoh is a feminine principle associated with water. In yet another version of this myth, and this one is found in Harold Scheub's A Dictionary of African Mythology, two forces of creation, Dia and Gla, brought forth Pharaoh associated with the sky and Pemba associated with the earth. So again, you have that world parent myth type. And then Pharaoh has a male twin or husband called Koni, but he is basically following Pharaoh's lead in this account of creation. And so in that story, Mangala makes the pond where Pharaoh lives, but then the pond overflows and there is a great downpour of rain which causes a flood, and Pharaoh and her people, as well as some animals, survive the flood by going into an ark which drifted for 7 days but then settled. And when the waters recede, Pharaoh emerges with her people and the first blacksmith, and they form the first village, planting the first seeds, creating earth as we know it. And in this version, under Pharaoh's influence, the earth could experience night and day, the changing of the seasons, and the general ordering of life. The account also states that the Niger River comes from Pharaoh's own body. So there is something about this myth which actually makes me think of the Egyptian creation myth, which is so tied to the flooding of the Nile. And I think that's a common theme in riverine civilizations. The people truly understand that their lives are tied to the flooding and receding waters of the river that comes with fertile soil and seeds and fish and everything that makes for a good life. And so you have this one myth, just intricately detailed. This summary truly doesn't do it justice. I doubt the recorded, documented translations do it justice. But if you look at it, it's just ultimately points back to the land as if to say, look, listen, before your great kings and your treaties and your declarations, before your ceremonies and your practices, before all these things which you hold on to, you have a story with the land, a story with the waters, a story with the plants, a story with the animals. And this to me is the power of creation myths, their ability to turn our attention back to the beginning and the common origins we share with all that exists. We'll stop here for this week, but please come back next week for our final episode on creation myths from the African continent.